On a cold, rainy night, Big Shaq spots a little girl crying alone at a bus stop, shivering and clutching a crumpled piece of paper. When he asks where her parents are, she barely whispers, "He's looking for me." What starts as a simple act of kindness quickly turns into a dangerous race against time. A missing mother, a powerful man with dark secrets, and a horrifying truth waiting to be uncovered. Ellie isn't just lost. She's running. But from who? And why? As Shaq digs deeper, the stakes grow higher. Will he uncover the truth before it's too late? Stay until the end, because some heroes don't wear capes. They just pay attention. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The streets were nearly empty, the city bathed in a soft glow from flickering streetlights as Big Shaq drove through the quiet roads. The rain had been falling steadily for the past hour, covering the windshield in a rhythmic pattern as his wipers worked overtime. It was late. Too late for anyone to be out alone. As he turned onto a dimly lit street near an old bus stop, something made him press the brakes. A small figure sat hunched on the bench, arms wrapped around her knees, shoulders trembling. Shaq's eyes narrowed as he pulled the car to the curb. A little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, her frame swallowed by a thin, oversized hoodie. The hood was pulled up, but the fabric was soaked through, doing little to shield her from the cold. Her legs were pulled up to her chest, her sneakers muddy and damp. Even from inside the car, Shaq could see the way her small hands clutched her arms, shivering violently. Something was very, very wrong. Shaq turned off the ignition and exhaled, scanning the area. There were no other cars, no adults nearby, no signs of someone coming back for her. The bus stop shelter was old, barely functional, its flickering light casting eerie shadows over the cracked pavement. No child should be out here alone, especially not at this hour. His gut told him to be careful, but it also told him he couldn't just drive away. Shaq grabbed the hoodie from his passenger seat, stepped out of the car, and made his way toward the girl. As soon as Shaq's footsteps hit the pavement, the girl tensed. She curled in on herself even more, her tiny frame trembling harder. She had heard him. Shaq slowed his pace, keeping his voice low and calm. "Hey there, kid," he said, stopping a few feet away. "You okay?" The girl didn't answer. Her shoulders stiffened and she subtly shrank back against the bus stop pole, as if making herself as small as possible. Shaq's eyes flicked to her hands. They were clenched tightly into fists, knuckles white. She was scared. He crouched down, making himself less intimidating. "I'm not gonna hurt you, okay? Just making sure you're all right." He set the hoodie down on the bench beside her, keeping his hands visible. "It's cold out here. You should put this on." She finally moved, just a little. Her head lifted ever so slightly, and wide, glassy eyes peeked out from under the damp hood. Big, round, and filled with tears. She had been crying. A sharp pang hit Shaq in the chest. "Where are your parents?" he asked softly. The girl hesitated, then slowly shook her head. "Not here." Shaq's brows furrowed. "Are you waiting for someone?" Another small shake of the head. Shaq exhaled, forcing himself to stay patient. Something was holding her back from talking. He could see it. The fear, the hesitation, the way she kept glancing around like she was afraid someone would find her. Still crouched, he gently asked, "What's your name?" The girl's bottom lip quivered. She wiped at her damp cheek with the sleeve of her hoodie before whispering, "Ellie." Shaq gave a small nod. At least now she was talking. "All right, Ellie," Shaq said, keeping his tone gentle. "Can you tell me why you're out here all alone?" She dropped her gaze to the pavement, fingers twisting into the fabric of her hoodie. Silence. Shaq could tell she was fighting an internal battle. She wanted to speak, but something, or someone, had scared her into silence. A bad feeling settled in his chest. He shifted slightly, keeping his voice calm. "Ellie, I don't know what's going on, but I promise I just want to help. You don't have to be scared of me." Her little fingers curled tighter. She swallowed hard, then hesitated before whispering something so softly, Shaq almost didn't hear it. "He told me to wait." Shaq's muscles tensed. "He?" His voice remained steady. Who told you to wait? Ellie's breath hitched. She quickly shook her head, looking around again, as if terrified that simply saying it out loud would make someone appear. Who the hell had left this child alone in the middle of the night? Shaq kept his expression calm, but his instincts were in overdrive. His mind raced with possibilities. A runaway? A lost child? Or something far, far worse? The rain fell harder, drops hitting the pavement in an uneven rhythm. Ellie flinched at the sound, as if every noise put her on edge. Shaq's protective instincts kicked in. He didn't know what had happened to her yet, but one thing was crystal clear. She wasn't safe, and he wasn't leaving without her. Shaq glanced back at his car, then at Ellie. If someone had left her here on purpose, they could still be nearby. And if they came back, what would happen to her? His jaw clenched. No way in hell was he letting that happen. He slowly stood up, careful not to startle her. Ellie, listen to me, he said, his voice firm but kind. It's not safe for you to stay out here. I know you're scared, but I can help. Can I take you somewhere warm? Ellie stared at him for a long moment, her small chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Her eyes flicked between him, the hoodie he had given her, and the empty street stretching beyond the bus stop. Shaq could see the fear in her, but he also saw something else. Hesitation, uncertainty, and the smallest flicker of hope. After a painfully long moment, she gave the tiniest nod. Shaq exhaled, relieved. All right, he said softly. Let's get out of here. Ellie hesitated for only a second before she finally reached for the hoodie. She pulled it over her damp clothes, the fabric swallowing her tiny frame. And then, without a word, she slipped her small hand into his. Shaq felt something tighten in his chest. Who had left this little girl so scared? And why? One thing was certain. This wasn't over. As he led her toward the car, his mind was already working, piecing things together. He didn't know where this night was heading yet, but one way or another, he was going to find out. Shaq sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his mind running in circles as the little girl beside him sat stiffly, barely moving. The rhythmic hum of the heater filled the car, offering warmth against the icy rain that still pattered against the windows, but Ellie didn't seem to notice. She sat wrapped in the oversized hoodie he had given her, knees tucked to her chest, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric as if it was the only thing holding her together. He had seen fear before. Real fear. Not the kind kids had when they were scared of the dark or monsters under the bed, but the kind that settled deep, the kind that told a story of something much worse. And Ellie? She had that look. Shaq glanced at her from the corner of his eye, trying to keep his voice light. Ellie, can you tell me where your parents are? Silence. She didn't even flinch, her eyes locked onto the car's dashboard like she was somewhere far away. He tried again, softer this time. Did someone leave you at the bus stop? Nothing. Her grip on the hoodie tightened, knuckles turning white. Shaq's jaw clenched. Something was wrong. His gaze dropped to her shoes, muddy, soaked, and scuffed. A girl her age wouldn't just be wandering around alone on a rainy night. She had been running from something. But what? He sighed, keeping his movements slow as he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a clean napkin. Gently, he passed it to her. You got a little... He motioned to her cheek, where dried tear streaks mixed with the dampness of the rain. For a second, she didn't move. Then, almost reluctantly, she took it. She wiped her face in quick, rough motions before looking back down at her lap, fingers curling into the fabric of her hoodie again. Shaq tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, debating his next move. He wasn't going to force her to talk, but he needed something, anything to figure out what was going on. And then, he saw it. A small, crumpled piece of torn paper peeking out from under her clenched fist. She was holding on to it like her life depended on it. What's that? He asked casually, nodding toward her hand. Ellie instantly tensed. Her body went rigid, her fingers clamping tighter around the paper. She didn't speak, didn't look at him. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Ellie? Still, nothing. His stomach twisted. What was on that paper? He knew better than to push, so he leaned back in his seat, letting silence settle between them for a moment before speaking again. Okay. How about this? Can I call someone for you? Maybe a family member? The reaction was instant. Ellie's breath hitched, her head jerking up so fast it startled him. Her wide, tear-filled eyes finally met his, full of pure panic. No! She gasped, shaking her head furiously. He'll find me! Shaq's pulse spiked. His instincts screamed at him. This wasn't just a lost child. This was something bigger. He kept his voice calm, steady. Who, Ellie? She clamped her lips shut, her whole body trembling. The air inside the car felt thick, heavy with unspoken words. Shaq leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Is someone chasing you? A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't say a word. Shaq inhaled deeply, his grip tightening on the wheel. He had dealt with plenty of tough situations in his life. Dangerous business deals, high-pressure negotiations, moments where everything was on the line. But this felt different. This felt personal. Who the hell was he? And what was Ellie so afraid of? One thing was clear. This little girl was in danger, and he wasn't letting her go until he found out why. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle by the time Shaq pulled into the parking lot of a small 24-hour diner. The neon sign flickers slightly, casting a soft red glow on the wet pavement. The place wasn't fancy, just one of those old-school spots with red vinyl booths and a waitress who probably knew every regular by name. Shaq parked the car and turned to Ellie, who still sat stiffly in the passenger seat, curled into herself. The oversized hoodie swallowed her small frame, and her fingers clutched the torn paper even tighter than before. We're just gonna grab some food, Shaq said, keeping his voice light. You must be hungry. Ellie hesitated, then gave a small nod. That was progress. Shaq stepped out and walked around to open her door, but she flinched slightly when he reached for the handle. That reaction told him more than words ever could. He froze for a second, then slowly stepped back, keeping his hands in plain sight. You got it, he said, nodding toward the door. Whenever you're ready. Ellie swallowed hard and, after a few seconds, reached for the handle herself. She climbed out carefully, still on edge, still watching everything around her. Shaq matched her pace, walking beside her instead of leading the way. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. Just a truck driver nursing a cup of coffee in the corner, and an older couple sharing a slice of pie. The warmth from the heaters immediately wrapped around them, making the icy night feel far away. A waitress in her 50s with tired eyes and a kind smile walked over, popping her gum as she grabbed 2 menus. Seat yourselves, hun, she said, eyeing Ellie. I'll bring some hot chocolate for the little one. Ellie didn't say anything, just climbed into a booth and tucked her legs under her. Shaq slid into the seat across from her and handed her the menu. Get whatever you want. Ellie stared at it like it was written in another language. Shaq watched as she glanced around the room, her eyes flicking between the door, the windows, the people inside. She wasn't just nervous. She was waiting for something, or someone. But whoever she was afraid of, they weren't here. Not yet, anyway. When the waitress placed a steaming cup of hot chocolate in front of Ellie, she flinched. Not because she was scared of the waitress, but because she wasn't used to people giving her things. Shaq noticed. He stayed quiet as she hesitated, then slowly wrapped her small fingers around the mug. The warmth seemed to ground her for a moment. Shaq let a few beats pass before finally speaking. Ellie, he said gently, can you tell me what happened? She froze. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then, barely above a whisper, she murmured, My mom told me to wait. Shaq's stomach tightened. He leaned in slightly. Wait where? She swallowed hard. At the bus stop. Shaq kept his expression neutral, even as his instincts screamed at him. And then? Ellie stared down at her cup. She was supposed to come back. Shaq exhaled slowly. But she didn't. A tiny shake of her head. The pieces were falling into place, but they weren't making sense yet. Shaq's voice stayed calm. How long have you been waiting, Ellie? She hesitated. I don't know. That answer made Shaq's stomach churn. It could have been hours. Or days. Did your mom tell you where she was going? Ellie's grip on the cup tightened. Her voice wavered. She said she had to take care of something. Shaq studied her carefully. He could see it now, the exhaustion beneath her eyes, the way she kept rubbing her hands together like she was trying to chase away a cold that had settled deep into her bones. She had been out there for too long. And the worst part? She knew something was wrong. What else did she say? He asked gently. Ellie's lips parted like she wanted to answer. But then, her entire body tensed. Her fingers curled into fists and she shook her head. Shaq knew that reaction. She was afraid of telling the truth. And fear like that? It didn't come from nowhere. Shaq leaned back, trying not to show how much this was getting to him. He needed more information, but not from her. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found a familiar name. Detective Jordan Banks, a former cop turned private investigator, one of the few people Shaq actually trusted. He kept his voice low as he stepped away from the table. "Jordan, I need a favor." On the other end, a deep voice sighed. "When do you ever call just to say hi?" "Not in the mood, man." Shaq glanced at Ellie, who was still gripping her cup. "I need you to look up a missing person." There was a pause. Then, Jordan's tone turned serious. "Who?" Shaq kept his voice steady. "Ellie's mom. I don't have a last name, just the first. Lauren." Jordan exhaled sharply. "That's not much to go on. Do what you can." Another pause. Then, "All right. Give me a few minutes." Shaq hung up and slid back into the booth. Ellie watched him carefully. "You okay?" he asked. She gave a small nod. He studied her for a second before motioning to the menu again. "Pick something. You need to eat." Ellie hesitated, but eventually pointed to a grilled cheese sandwich. Shaq smiled. "Good choice." 15 minutes later, Shaq's phone buzzed. He stepped outside into the cold night air, answering immediately. "Tell me you found something." Jordan's voice was grim. "Shaq, you need to listen carefully." Shaq's shoulders tensed. "Go on." Jordan hesitated, then said, "Ellie's mother, Lauren, was reported missing 3 days ago." Shaq's breath hitched. 3 days. She was last seen at her apartment. The landlord said she left in a hurry that night, but no one's heard from her since. Shaq's pulse pounded. Jordan's voice darkened. "And it gets worse." Shaq didn't say anything, waiting. "There was a man looking for her the same night she disappeared," Jordan continued. "A guy with a record, name's Victor Langley." Shaq's grip tightened around his phone. He didn't know the name, but he knew the type. Jordan continued. "He's got multiple assault charges, mostly domestic. Never did real time. Connections helped him walk. But here's the thing. He was never linked to Lauren. No reports filed, no known relationship." Shaq's jaw clenched. Then why was he looking for her? Another long pause. Then Jordan spoke carefully. "Because she wasn't the one he wanted." Shaq's blood turned ice cold. He was looking for Ellie. Shaq felt something dark coil in his chest. He turned to look through the diner window at Ellie, who sat quietly in the booth, her small hands wrapped around the warm cup. His gut had been right from the start. This wasn't just a lost child. This was something bigger, something dangerous. Ellie's mom was missing. A dangerous man was looking for her. And now, Ellie was in his care. Shaq took a slow breath, his decision made. There was no way in hell he was letting her go. Shaq stood outside the diner, gripping his phone as the cold night air wrapped around him. The street was quiet, but his mind was anything but. Ellie's mother had been missing for 3 days. No phone activity, no bank withdrawals. Nothing. That wasn't normal. That was bad. Jordan's voice was sharp through the receiver. "Shaq, I don't like this. This woman didn't just disappear. Either she's in hiding or someone made her disappear." Shaq exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting toward the diner window. Ellie was still at the booth, staring down at her half-eaten grilled cheese. She hadn't spoken much after revealing her mother had told her to wait at the bus stop. It was like she was afraid to say more. His gut tightened. He needed answers. "Her daughter gave me an address," Shaq muttered, pulling a napkin from his pocket where he had scribbled it down earlier. 1135 Harper Street. There was a pause on the other end. Then Jordan sighed. "That's not right." Shaq's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" I mean, that address doesn't exist. Shaq's grip on the phone tightened. That didn't make sense. Are you sure? I checked city records. There's no Harper Street in this district. Either she gave you a fake address or she was told a fake address. Silence. Shaq's pulse pounded. If Lauren had given Ellie a false address, it could mean two things. Either she was trying to protect her daughter, or someone had forced her to say it. Neither option made him feel any better. Jordan's voice lowered. Listen, man. You need to tread carefully. If someone's after this kid, you can bet they're watching for her. Shaq already knew that. He could feel it. He turned back toward the diner and walked inside. Ellie barely looked up as he slid into the booth across from her. Her tiny hands were wrapped around her cup again, her knuckles pale from how hard she was gripping it. Shaq kept his voice steady. Ellie, I need you to help me, okay? She blinked up at him, her big, tired eyes searching his face. You told me your mom gave you an address, he continued gently. Do you remember if she wrote it down anywhere? Ellie shook her head. She just told me. Shaq nodded slowly. Do you know where she was going? Ellie hesitated, then whispered. She was scared. Shaq's chest tightened. Ellie's gaze flickered to the napkin he had written on earlier. Did I say it wrong? She asked quietly. Shaq forced a small smile. No, kid. Not your fault. He exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. I just think your mom was trying to keep you safe. Ellie lowered her eyes. That's what she always does. Shaq's heart ached. This little girl had seen too much. Shaq leaned forward slightly. Ellie, can you tell me about your dad? The moment the words left his mouth, Ellie went pale. Her little shoulders tensed, her fingers gripping the cup so tightly, Shaq thought it might crack. She shook her head, her breathing quickening. He's not my dad. Shaq's stomach dropped. That reaction wasn't just fear. It was terror. Ellie's voice came out barely above a whisper. He's the bad man. Shaq felt something dark settle in his chest. Whoever this man was, he had done something. Shaq kept his voice low, steady. Ellie, who is he? She shook her head harder. Mom said not to talk about him. Shaq exhaled slowly. This was worse than he thought. He wasn't dealing with a simple case of a missing person. This was something much bigger, something dangerous. And now, Ellie was in the middle of it. Shaq leaned back in the booth, trying to piece everything together. A little girl, left at a bus stop. A mother, missing without a trace. A fake address. And a man. A bad man, who had something to do with it all. Shaq's blood boiled. He had seen a lot of things in his life. But this was unforgivable. One thing was certain. He wasn't going to stop until he found out the truth. The air inside the diner felt thick, heavy with unspoken fear. Shaq sat across from Ellie, his mind racing. Every instinct in his body screamed that she wasn't safe. Someone was looking for her. Someone dangerous. He needed to move. Now Shaq's fingers hovered over his phone, ready to call Jordan again, but something made him glance toward the diner's front window. And that's when he saw it. A black SUV, parked just across the street. Engine running. Tinted windows. Shaq's breath slowed. Someone was watching. His stomach tightened as his eyes swept over the vehicle, assessing. It hadn't been there when they arrived. No one had stepped out. Whoever was inside wasn't here for a meal. They were waiting. For who? For Ellie? Shaq's entire body tensed. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. The little girl in front of him wasn't just lost. She was being hunted. Shaq inhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. He had to act fast, but smart. Ellie, he said gently, keeping his voice casual. You finished eating? She nodded slowly, though her appetite had long disappeared. Shaq gave her a small, reassuring smile. All right, let's get out of here, yeah? Ellie hesitated but slid out of the booth, clutching the oversized hoodie he had given her earlier. She was still clutching that crumpled piece of paper in her tiny fist. Shaq didn't rush, didn't let his tension show. He moved slowly, naturally, like nothing was wrong. But his mind? It was already planning 5 steps ahead. He placed a few bills on the table, nodded at the waitress, and then rested a gentle hand on Ellie's shoulder as they headed for the exit. As soon as the diner door swung open, the cold night air hit them. Shaq's sharp gaze flicked back toward the SUV. The engine revved slightly. Shaq's pulse spiked. They needed to disappear. Now, instead of heading straight for his car. Too predictable, too easy to follow. Shaq turned toward the alley next to the diner. Shortcut, he murmured to Ellie, steering her gently. Stay close to me. She did. Without a word, she tucked herself near his side, her tiny fingers gripping the sleeve of his jacket. As soon as they slipped into the alley, Shaq pulled out his phone. He needed backup, the right kind. Jordan wasn't enough. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This was bigger. He scrolled fast and dialed. The phone rang twice before a smooth, authoritative voice answered. Shaq, didn't think I'd be hearing from you at this hour. Listen, Carter, Shaq cut in, his tone clipped. I need your help, now. On the other end, Damian Carter, one of the best lawyers and child protection specialists in the city, immediately caught on. Tell me what's happening. Shaq kept his steps quick but steady as he led Ellie through the alley. He explained everything in a few sharp sentences. A missing mother, a child left alone, a man after her. And now, a black SUV watching their every move. Carter's voice turned razor sharp. Where are you now? Shaq glanced behind them. No sign of the SUV yet, but that wouldn't last. Diner on Fremont, heading east. Good. Keep moving. I'll make the calls. A brief pause. Shaq, do not let her out of your sight. Shaq's jaw locked. Wasn't planning on it. He hung up and picked up the pace. Ellie didn't complain, didn't ask questions. She just followed, trusting him. That only made Shaq more determined. They reached a side street, slipping between parked cars to avoid open sidewalks. Shaq kept checking their surroundings, every nerve on high alert. Then, a low engine hum. Shaq's heart pounded. He didn't need to turn around to know. The SUV had found them. Ellie must have sensed it too because her grip on his sleeve tightened. Shaq moved fast. Come on, kid. He spotted a narrow stairwell leading down to a basement entrance of an old bookstore. Perfect. Without hesitation, he pulled open the door and ushered Ellie inside. The second it shut behind them, he pressed his back against it, listening. Outside, the SUV rolled past slowly. The engine idled. Then, after what felt like forever, it drove off. Shaq let out a slow breath. Not safe yet, but safer. Ellie looked up at him, eyes wide. Are they gone? For now, he said, crouching in front of her. But we're not taking any chances. She nodded, her little face still pale but trusting. Shaq felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about protecting her tonight. This was about making sure she never had to run again. Shaq pulled out his phone. One more call. Jordan answered immediately. You good? No, Shaq said bluntly. We're being followed. A sharp exhale. How close? They found us at the diner, black SUV, followed us a few blocks before I lost them. Silence. Then, Shaq, this is getting dangerous. No kidding. Jordan's voice darkened. You need to get that kid somewhere secure. If they already know where she is, it's only a matter of time before they try again. Shaq knew that. He had already made his decision. I'm taking her with me. Jordan hesitated. Shaq. She's got no one else, Shaq said firmly. Her mom is missing. The system? They'll just dump her somewhere temporary and pray for the best. His eyes hardened. That's not happening. Jordan sighed, but he didn't argue. Carter's handling the legal side? Yeah. All right. Then I'll handle the rest. A pause. But Shaq? Be careful, man. Whoever is after her, they won't stop. Shaq glanced at Ellie, who was now sitting on the bottom step, her small hands still curled around that crumpled paper. They won't have to, Shaq muttered, because I'll get to them first. The rest of the night was a blur. Carter made the right calls. Jordan pulled the right strings. By the time Shaq pulled into his private property outside the city, Ellie was fast asleep in the passenger seat, tucked into his hoodie. exhaustion finally winning over fear. Shaq watched her for a moment. Everything about this night had changed him. He had started as a stranger just trying to help a kid in need. Now, he was her only chance at survival. He exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. No matter what it took, he was going to keep her safe. No matter what. And whoever was after her. They were about to learn just how big of a mistake they had made. Shaq sat in the dimly lit office, his phone pressed tightly against his ear. The weight of the past 24 hours sat heavy on his shoulders, but there was no time to rest. The pieces of the puzzle had finally come together, and what he had uncovered was worse than he had imagined. Ellie's mother, Lauren, hadn't just disappeared. She had been running, hiding from a man who had spent years trying to control her. A man with money, connections, and a darkness inside him that had left a trail of fear and broken lives. His name was Victor Langley, a well-known real estate mogul with deep pockets and a reputation clean enough to fool the public. But behind closed doors, he was a monster, a manipulator, a predator, a man who never let go of what he believed belonged to him. Lauren had been his victim. She had tried to escape him before, disappearing with Ellie when she was just a baby. For years, she had moved from place to place, always looking over her shoulder. But somehow, he had found her again. And now, she was missing. Shaq exhaled slowly, gripping the phone as Jordan's voice came through the other end. "We've got proof, but it's not enough to nail him completely," Jordan said, frustration lacing his tone. "The cops can't touch him without something solid. He's careful, too careful." Shaq's jaw clenched. "Then we make him slip." Jordan hesitated. "You're planning something." "Damn right I am," Shaq muttered. He glanced toward Ellie, who was curled up on the couch in his office, finally asleep. She had barely spoken since last night, but the fear in her eyes hadn't faded. She needed her mother and Shaq. He was going to bring her back, no matter what it took. Shaq moved carefully. He knew men like Victor, powerful, arrogant, untouchable. The kind of man who thought money could buy him out of anything. But power made people reckless, and recklessness, that left cracks. Through Jordan's network, they found one of Victor's men, a fixer named Daryl, someone who had been covering up Victor's dirt for years. He wasn't loyal, he was just scared. And fear? That was something Shaq knew how to use. The setup was simple. A meeting. A business deal that Victor couldn't resist. A way to lure him out. To make him talk. But what Victor wouldn't know, Shaq would be recording every word. The meeting took place in a high-end hotel suite, the kind of place Victor was used to conducting his business. The lighting was warm, the furniture expensive, and the air thick with the scent of overpriced cigars. Victor Langley sat in an armchair, exuding the kind of smug confidence that came from years of getting away with everything. Shaq sat across from him, leaning back, his expression unreadable. "So?" Victor said smoothly, swirling a glass of bourbon. "I hear you're interested in making things disappear." Shaq played along, his tone casual. "Depends on what you need." Victor chuckled, shaking his head. No, Mr. Turner. The real question is, what do you need?" Shaq held his gaze, silent. Victor leaned forward, setting his drink down. "Men like us, we don't play by the same rules as everyone else. We take what we want. We don't ask. We don't beg." His lips curled into something resembling a smirk. "And if someone tries to take from us, well, we remind them who's in charge." Shaq felt his blood turn to ice. Victor didn't know it yet, but he had just made his biggest mistake. Shaq exhaled, keeping his voice steady. "Is that what happened to Lauren?" For the first time, Victor's expression flickered, but he recovered quickly, chuckling softly. "Women are like real estate, Mr. Turner. Some just need persuasion to know their place." Shaq's hands fisted under the table. Victor tilted his head, studying him. "Tell me, do you know where she is?" Shaq didn't blink. "I was hoping you'd tell me." Victor smiled. "Let's just say she won't be a problem anymore." That was it. The moment Shaq had been waiting for. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his phone and setting it on the table. The screen was already lit, the red recording icon flashing. Victor's smirk vanished. Shaq leaned forward, his voice cold. You just confessed, Langley. For the first time, Victor Langley looked afraid. The door burst open. Jordan stepped in, followed by 2 detectives. Badges flashed, guns drawn. Victor shot to his feet, his confidence shattered. This is ridiculous, he snapped. You can't prove anything. Shaq stood slowly, rolling his shoulders. I don't need to. You just did. Jordan held up a tablet, playing back the recording of Victor's own words. Every incriminating statement, every damning syllable. Victor's face turned ashen. Victor Langley, one of the detectives said, stepping forward. You're under arrest. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Cuffs clicked, protests were shouted, but nothing mattered. Because the monster had finally fallen. Shaq should have felt satisfied. Victor Langley was going to prison. His power, his money, none of it could save him now. But something was still missing. Lauren. They had taken down the man who had been hunting her, but she was still gone. Shaq ran a hand down his face, exhaustion hitting him, but he refused to slow down. Ellie was still waiting, still hoping, and he wasn't going to let her down. As the detectives hauled Victor away, Jordan turned to Shaq. You did it, he said. This bastard is finished. Shaq nodded, but his eyes were distant. Not yet. Jordan sighed. You're thinking about Lauren. Shaq's jaw tightened. She's still out there, Jordan. I know, and we'll find her. Shaq exhaled. Not we. Me. Jordan hesitated, then nodded. Shaq glanced at the phone in his hand. A single unanswered message from Ellie. 3 words that made his chest tighten. Did you find her? Shaq closed his eyes for a second, then opened them, his resolve stronger than ever. He wasn't done. Lauren was still missing. And Shaq? He wasn't stopping until he brought her home. The world feels different now. The weight of uncertainty, of fear, of constant running, it was finally over. But not without scars, not without pain. Shaq stood in the hospital corridor, arms crossed, his usually unshakable frame carrying a tension that hadn't left since this whole nightmare began. The walls were the usual sterile white, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. Nurses moved quietly past him. Their voices hushed, their movements routine. But for Shaq, nothing about this moment was routine. Through the small window in the door, he could see Ellie sitting by the hospital bed, her tiny fingers wrapped gently around her mother's hand. Lauren was alive. That was the only thing that mattered. Beaten, bruised, but breathing. She had survived. The search for her had been agonizing. Hours spent chasing leads, Jordan pulling every favor he had left in law enforcement, Shaq using every connection at his disposal. And then, finally, a breakthrough. Shaq exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. The nightmare was over. But the healing, that was just the beginning. Inside the hospital room, Ellie hadn't let go of her mother's hand since the moment she woke up. Lauren's eyes fluttered open slowly, adjusting to the light, her body still weak. But the second she saw Ellie's face, she found her strength. Baby, she whispered, her voice raw. Ellie's breath hitched. Mom? Tears welled in the little girl's eyes as she leaned forward, carefully hugging her mother, afraid she might break. Shaq turned away, giving them their moment. This wasn't his victory. This was theirs. It wasn't until a soft knock on the door made him look up that he realized Jordan had arrived. The detective stepped inside, hands in his pockets, looking between the mother and daughter reunion before turning to Shaq. She's safe, Jordan murmured. And Victor? He's not walking away from this. Shaq nodded but didn't respond. Justice had been served, but it wasn't about Victor anymore. It was about Ellie. It was about making sure she never had to be afraid again. Lauren's voice, still weak but filled with emotion, broke the silence. Mr. Turner. Shaq turned back. Lauren was looking at him now, her eyes filled with gratitude, with something deeper than words could express. I don't know how to thank you. Shaq shook his head, offering her a small smile. You already did. You survived. She swallowed hard, blinking back tears, then turned back to Ellie, stroking her daughter's hair. Shaq knew what that touch meant. The silent promise. The unspoken vow that no one would ever separate them again. He had seen a lot in his life: power, corruption, greed. But this? A mother and daughter reunited after everything they had endured? This was real. This was everything. Days later, Shaq stood outside a quiet suburban home, watching as Ellie ran through the freshly cut grass, her laughter echoing in the warm afternoon air. Lauren had been given a new identity, a fresh start. Thanks to Carter's legal work, she and Ellie were far away from Victor's shadow, with no traces left for anyone to find them. And Shaq had made sure they had more than just safety. A real home. A place where Ellie could just be a kid. No more hiding. No more fear. Just life. Lauren stepped onto the porch, watching her daughter with the kind of soft awe only a mother could have. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you," she said, looking up at Shaq. He kept his eyes on Ellie. "You don't have to." She exhaled, shaking her head. Most people would have just walked away. Shaq finally looked at her. Most people don't pay attention. She studied him for a moment, as if memorizing his face, then gave a small, knowing smile. Ellie suddenly dashed toward them, arms outstretched, eyes bright with joy. "Shaq!" she called, her little voice filled with excitement. And before he could react, she wrapped her arms around him, hugging him tight. Shaq hesitated for just a second. Then he hugged her back. "You saved me," Ellie murmured against his chest. Shaq swallowed hard, staring down at this tiny, strong kid who had been through hell and still found a way to smile. He knelt down, leveling his eyes with hers, his voice soft but steady. "No, kid, you saved yourself." Ellie grinned, squeezing his hand once before running back toward the yard, finally free. Shaq watched her go, exhaling slowly, feeling something inside him settle. He hadn't gone looking for this fight. He hadn't planned on stepping in. But maybe some things find you when you need them the most. Maybe this was always meant to happen. As he turned to leave, the warm breeze carrying Ellie's laughter through the air, he knew one thing for sure. Not all heroes wear capes. Some just pay attention. Screen fades to black. Ellie's story isn't just a thrilling tale. It's a powerful reminder. How many people out there are waiting for someone to notice, someone to help? Shaq didn't have superpowers. He just paid attention, and that changed everything. What would you have done in Shaq's place? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that prove one act of kindness can change a life forever.